Hey guys, so let's look at an example game. This is one that's been requested on the chess.com forums by Maestro Zero, who's rated 1060 in this game. This is a 15 plus 10 game. This is the shortest time control that I advise you do if you want to improve. And his opponent in this is Shiv Mandraha, who's rated 1284, so quite a lot higher than Maestro. So let's see how it starts. We're looking from the black perspective because that's who's requested it. So white starts with d4. Now, from a point of view of controlling the board, d4 is the second most common first move for white after e4, and the reason is that when you play e4, as we've seen, then that opens up the room for the light square bishop and for the queen, so you're immediately controlling more squares than that. When you open with d4, then you've opened up these squares for the dark squared bishop, but the other piece that's been opened up is the king rather than the queen, and the king therefore doesn't control any more squares because the king can only move one square at a time. But this is what we've got. We've got d4 on the board. I'm a d4 player myself. Black responds with e5. Now, in terms of controlling the board, again, black is risking here giving up material because he's put his pawn right in front of the developed white pawn, and this black pawn is not protected. So if white goes ahead and captures the pawn, which white does, then white is now controlling more squares of the board. In a sense, he's looking at d6 and f6 here. On the other hand, because black's moved his king's pawn, then his queen is looking at this diagonal, and also his dark squared bishop is on this diagonal as well. So why has he given up a pawn on his very first move? It's a known opening. This is called the England gambit. It's a risky opening, like most gambits are. But okay if you know how to play it. So let's see what happens next. So white's just taken the pawn. Black develops his knight, which makes sense. White responds with his opposite knight, so as to defend the e5 pawn. That often makes sense. You very often see the opposing knights coming out together. Black now moves his queen. Now, one of the general pieces of advice in chess is not to move your queen too early, or certainly not to move your queen out too early. Why is this? Well, let's consider it from the point of view of controlling the board. If you move your queen out into or towards your opponent's half of the board, that may give your opponent opportunities to harass your queen and chase it around the board. And quite often they can do this by moving a pawn out or moving a piece out. And when they move pawns and pieces forward, it's what we call developing the pieces, and in doing that, in each move they can then take control over more squares on the board, whereas you are not getting control of any more squares because you're having to move your queen around. Okay, so that's the reason why we say develop your minor pieces early, generally. Don't move your queen too early, generally. So the reason why black's done this obviously is to put two attackers against the pawn on e5. So white responds by bringing out a second defender. Black obviously now can't take the pawn, because if he takes with a knight, white recaptures with a knight or bishop. Black can't then retake with the queen because he'll lose the queen. Okay, so what he does is he finds this move, which was good. I mean, it took 12 seconds over this move. And this is something I want to bear in mind, considering rule number 1, take your time. This is a 15 plus 10 game. Okay, so in general, you should be thinking about taking up to a minute for each move, and you should be fine taking up to a minute. the longest taken in this game. We've got one move that was 55 seconds, we've got one move that was 31 seconds. Everything else was below 30 seconds. Right, so the players, obviously aren't thinking, take your time, take your time. But let's look at this move, because it looks dangerous. Black's queen is now on b4. Black is in check, so has to get out of check on the next move. Black's queen is also attacking the bishop here on f4. Obviously, the king is in check there, and the queen is also attacking. If I can switch it on, there you go. The b2 pawn. So I don't know if there's a way for white to get out of check and protect both the bishop and the pawn on b2. I think the obvious move, if you think about it, would be to either bring the bishop back to d2, where it's covering the king, and also then going into relative safety, or alternatively could bring the queen out to d2, but either of those moves leaves the b2 pawn undefended. So let's see what white does. Oops. So white moves the knight out from b1 to block the d2 square. That achieves one of the things that white wanted to do, which is to get out of check, but it does not defend the bishop. So black obviously snatches up the bishop. Bishops are good pieces, they're long range pieces, and a bishop can control 7 squares on a diagonal across the board, or if it's in the middle of the board, it can control several squares in all directions. So that's a good piece. Black has now given himself the chance of occupying the board more by taking material off the board. So I think that move was rushed on white's part, even though he took nearly 20 seconds to do it. Didn't take long enough. White responds by just pushing the pawn on e forwards, attacking the queen. So to push the queen away, this is what we were talking about before. The queen therefore moves away. So h6 is maybe not the strongest place for the queen to go. I mean, what's it looking at? It's looking at this pawn here on e3, which is defended by another pawn. It's looking at this pawn on h2, which is defended by a rook. The queen maybe could have gone somewhere like possibly b4, where it's renewing its attack on the b2 pawn, possibly. White then takes advantage of having pushed forwards his e-pawn. When you move the king's pawn, it then releases the light square bishop, in white's case, and also the queen. So white moves the bishop out to a good square on c4, where it is eyeing down on this f7 square, which is a very common place to attack. When you think about it, if you go back to the very beginning of the game, even before anything's moved, these two pawns here, the f pawns, so you've got f2 there on white side and f7 here. The only piece that's defending each of those is the king, which is why you very often find bishops coming out to attack this, and very often the knight jumps a couple of jumps forward to attack the f-pawn with 2 pieces. Black responds with knight to e7. This is then pairing the 2 knights. They are now covering each other's, watching each other's backs, so to speak, which is not a bad thing. The knights come out, therefore controlling a little bit more of the board. White pushes ahead with h4 now. This is an interesting move. Not quite sure of what black is trying to achieve with this, because now it's made it less likely that white is going to castle on the king's side. But let's see what develops. Black then moves his knight out to f5 again, which is an unusual place for it to go, because it can't then go to d6 because there's a pawn there. Can't go to d4 because there's a pawn on e3. It also can't go to g3 because of the f2 pawn. It also cannot capture the pawn on h4 because this is defended twice by the rook and by the knight. So that's an interesting one. White then moves his knight into g5, where it's defended by the pawn on h4. Also, what you can see now, this is very typical, you've got the knight and the bishop both attacking now this f7 square. So if the knight comes in and captures that, it will then have a fork on the rook on h8 and the queen on h7. So black really needs to think about this and do something about it. Black here makes a very poor decision because he's moved his queen right into the firing line of white's queen. So I think I can probably tell what he was thinking. He was thinking, I need to defend f7. Okay, now he could have done that in a number of ways. One is that he could have captured e5 with his other knight because e5 is hanging, it's unprotected. Okay, but he didn't see that one. He could have simply moved his queen along to g6, but that would have not been so good because white could have then gone ahead, captured with the bishop. They're attacking the queen and the king. Black would have had to have captured with the queen, and then the knight would have come in to take the queen. So what that means is that black has got a queen and a pawn, which is worth 10 points, because a queen is worth 9, in return for losing only 6 points, because the bishops and knights are both worth about 3. So that wouldn't have been ideal, but this move would have, I think, been the best move from the knight to capture e5, because then he could have recaptured with a knight, and he'd have probably been alright. But instead what he does, he makes a blunder, simply hasn't taken his time, hasn't looked at the whole board, even though this is the longest amount of time spent on any move in the game. It's still a blunder. So it took 55 seconds, moved the queen into a place where it could be captured. Then white rushes his move. He only took 4 seconds on that move and decides to go straight in and capture the pawn, but capturing it with the wrong piece, because what's he done here? He's taken a pawn. The knight is only attacking the rook. The rook could easily move out of the way. Now, if he'd captured instead with the bishop here, then he would have check, and he'd be attacking the queen, which would have been a much better move. Now, let's see if black notices that his queen is under attack. No, he doesn't. He's completely missed it. And he's only thinking about his rook, so he moves his rook out of the way, and his queen falls. Black then responds. So yeah, white took no time to that. Black responds by attacking the queen with the pawn, but here not realizing that the pawn on h7 is now hanging. It was hanging before. So if he'd moved the h-pawn forward, might have been better. Although, of course, we've got a serious danger here. We've got a discovered attack. If this knight moves out of the way, then black will be in check. So that could be pretty dangerous. But black played g6. White went ahead and captured on h7. Black then plays a decent move, pushing the rook forward to g7, because the rook is defending this knight. Sorry, this pawn on g6. Everything is more or less defended. White moves the queen back to h8, which isn't a huge threat because the bishop's defending the rook, the king is defending the bishop. Black here then pushes his pawn from d7 to d5, attacking the bishop, but the pawn is undefended, so the bishop goes ahead and captures. Now black has spotted an opportunity. Maybe his king is in a little bit of peril right now, but he goes on the attack anyway. So obviously he's looking at the c2 square, which is another common pawn to attack, like the f1. If you can attack that with a knight, if the king hasn't castled, then you can fork the king and the rook. Let's see what white does in response. Brings the bishop back, so it is defending that c2 pawn. Good move. Black goes ahead anyway and captures and loses his knight, so that was another mistake. But then, because the bishop recaptures, so maybe it wasn't such a mistake. Black's played a smarter move than I appreciated. Black can then recapture the other knight, which was defended by the bishop. So Black has won only one pawn in that exchange. White moves his knight out, and then Black comes in with a check. There's actually no piece other than the knight that can block this check, so the king moves. Black moves his pawn forwards. White comes in with a check. Black moves his king out of the way. I think that was probably the only move he can play. White then comes in and captures a knight. Black recaptures with the bishop, but this leaves then the rook on a8 is now on pre. The queen could have gone ahead and taken that. Instead, the queen goes ahead and takes the other rook, which is also undefended. Black moves, white comes down, black moves again, loses another rook, and then this is the end of the game. I think black resigns at this point because there's still time on the clock. So, all in all, the game really pivoted on this move when black was actually ahead at this point. He'd taken that bishop, captured that bishop earlier on in the game, and although he took some time, he just simply didn't take enough time to avoid this blunder. You know, if the way that I would play is I would take the queen, I'd hover, keep my finger down on the mouse button, hover over there. Okay, is there anything stupid about this? If I move my queen, what changes? Right? If I go to h5, what changes? Can it be taken? Have I left something undefended? Well, yes, it can clearly be taken by the white queen there. So I would say, well, that's no good as a move. Right? Even moving to here and putting up with an exchange in which I lose material would have been preferable. But if he'd taken more time, he could have found this knight takes e5 move, which would have both defended f7 and counterattacked the bishop as well. So I think one of the biggest lessons from this game is look at the way that the game ended. Right, 23 moves, ends by resignation because white has an overwhelming advantage. Black has blundered a bunch of pieces. But look, white still has 15 minutes on the clock. Black still has 12 minutes on the clock. Okay, so biggest lesson from the game, rule number 1, just take your time.